It all starts when a young man bitterly regrets trusting the words of that scoundrel. He holds the pen with great hesitation, unsure if he should really sign that suspicious document. Sitting in that cafe, the young man asks his friend if the deal is actually safe to invest in. The friend slams his hand on the table in annoyance, telling him to stop overthinking and just sign the paper already. The con artist tries to calm him down, saying he would never pull a scam on a great school partner. He guarantees that the money will yield a huge return, and that he only offered the opportunity because he cares about him. The fake friend reminds him of the day the young man had to take work calls at his own father's funeral. He claims he was heartbroken to see his colleague humiliating himself like that for his boss. The young man feels a deep anger hearing the guy use his late father, but he knows he can't do anything. With no other way out, he just signs the document, hoping those supposed good intentions are real. But he soon realizes he was a complete fool for falling for such a blatant story. 2 years pass, and the story shows us a dark room with the bathroom light revealing a bad situation. The young man appears kneeling in front of the toilet, painfully throwing up everything in his stomach. He deeply regrets having brought up even the few snacks he had finally managed to buy. At 28 years old, he realizes his life in South Korea is completely ruined. The scammer disappeared a year ago, leaving the guy alone to deal with a massive amount of debt. With a few hours left before his next shift, he decides to read a book to try to calm his tired mind. His only joy in this miserable life is reading the pages of his favorite novel called Dark Hitter. He has read that same story over 100 times and knows every detail by heart. Reading is the only moment he can escape his terrible reality for a few moments. Suddenly, he feels something strange in the air and glances away from the book's pages, very confused. Looking out the window, he notices several bright purple feathers floating mysteriously in the dark sky. He wonders, intrigued, if those are crow feathers shining in the middle of the night. At that moment, he starts coughing uncontrollably and ends up spitting up a frightening amount of blood. The blood runs from his mouth and completely stains the cover of the book he was holding so dearly. He feels an unbearable pain in his chest, as if his heart were glowing and about to explode. Unable to breathe properly, he falls to the floor while purple smoke starts to emanate from the mysterious book. With his face covered in blood, he curses his own life for ending in such a tragic way. The young man collapses on the bed, weak, wondering if this really is his meaningless end. The moment he accepts death, something very hot starts to boil intensely inside his body. He is indignant to realize that the last image in his mind before dying is the face of that con artist. Unable to react, he just watches the black feathers floating around him while he loses consciousness. A mysterious message appears in the darkness, confirming a mission and unlocking a special skill. The young man wakes up startled, his eyes glowing an intense shade of blue while he breathes with difficulty. He quickly gets up from the bed, wondering if everything he experienced was just a terrible nightmare. The young man blinks, still trying to recover from the shock of such a sudden transition. He looks around and realizes he is in an extremely luxurious and unknown room. Very confused, the young man observes the details of that fancy place, having no idea where he is. A sudden noise catches his attention, making the young man look immediately toward the window. He finds himself face to face with a giant red-eyed crow staring at him from outside the room. Upon approaching the window, the young man is shocked to see the night sky lit up by 3 different moons. Several huge crows start flapping their wings and flying around excitedly near the large structure. Dozens of gigantic birds fly past the windows of the immense castle under the light of the night. The young man focuses his gaze on the starry sky, trying to process that unbelievable and scary sight. Upon noticing the 3 colored moons, he starts to suspect he has been transported into the book he was reading. Looking at his own reflection in the glass, he is absolutely certain that he is no longer in his old world. A voice from outside calls him Prince Ranabaran, saying it is the maid, Anna. Who is there? The maid asks to come in, and the young man panics, telling her to wait because he isn't feeling well. But the door starts to open slowly, leaving the young man even more desperate with the situation. kitchen with an unbearable headache. He ends up collapsing on the bedroom floor before he can even stop her from entering. The maid says she will come back later, while the young man lying on the floor realizes his suspicions were totally correct. He holds his head tightly as he begins to connect the dots, realizing he ended up in the story of a book he had already read. He discovers that he has reincarnated into the universe of Dark Header and has now assumed the identity of the seventh prince, named Ranabaran. The young man falls into despair when he remembers that the destiny of this prince is to have a tragic and painful death right at the beginning of the book. Sitting alone, he deeply regrets having awakened inside a novel, specifically in the body of a condemned character. Suddenly, a mysterious man in dark glasses approaches and formally introduces himself as Sign. The young man is extremely startled to realize that the cold-looking man is the prince's personal advisor. Sign enters the room accompanied by a maid carrying a plate of food, saying he came personally because he was worried. The advisor adjusts his glasses on his face cynically and asks if the prince is already feeling a little better. The young man tries to remain totally calm and decides that the option at the moment is to pretend to be the real crown prince. He replies that he is much better, and the advisor feigns immediate relief at that unexpected answer. Sign rudely orders the young maid to quickly serve the special meal prepared for His Royal Highness. The girl serves the plate, trembling with terror, while the young man notices her fear, thinks the food looks like dog food. He tries to grab the teapot to serve his own tea, but ends up clumsily dropping the heavy object on the table. The hot liquid quickly spreads all over the table, making the environment tense in just 1 second. The young maid widens her eyes in complete desperation, as if she were facing a terrible death sentence. She immediately kneels, begging for forgiveness, while the young man is confused by that overly exaggerated reaction. The protagonist does not understand the reason for such panic, while the girl cleans the spilled liquid without stopping crying. Suddenly, he remembers a crucial detail about the terrible behavior of the true owner of that body. The former Ranabaran was a cruel and sadistic villain who used to beat and even kill his servants for any silly reason. Sign breaks the silence and apologizes for interrupting the moment, but says it is excellent to see the prince recovered. The man holds out a scroll with a cynical smile on his face, ready to pull his usual financial scam. He asks the prince to quickly sign that budget proposal, claiming it is a very urgent matter. The young man realizes the blatant lie and wonders what kind of urgent matter a prince considered useless would have. He knows very well that that document is totally fake and serves only to steal the resources destined for the prince. The advisor abuses this power because he is a distant relative of the empress, who rules the empire with an iron fist. The original prince would sign everything without reading, but the protagonist hesitates if he should sign to keep the original story. Noticing the delay, Sign mocks the prince, asking in a mocking tone if he happens to have forgotten how to sign his name. The young man is furious at being humiliated by a subordinate and curses his fate for reincarnating into such a weak character. The advisor insists in an invasive way, telling him not to think about anything and just sign the document once and for all. This sentence brings back a bitter memory of his past on Earth when his old friend deceived him with the same speech. The image of the scammer demanding his signature in the past resurfaces in his mind as a warning of imminent danger. He bites his lips in anger, realizing that this situation is identical to the one where he lost everything he had. The young man makes a firm decision in his heart, swearing that he will never again let himself be manipulated by anyone. Questions the advisor, pointing out that the bills are very strange and that budget is a waste of money. Sign lets out a mocking laugh and comments, surprised that he did not expect the prince to be capable of basic arithmetic. The man presses again, saying the food is going to get cold and that he will review the paper as soon as he signs it. Sign repeats the order in an authoritarian way, but is interrupted by the frightening noise of something being broken on the table. The maid gets a terrible shock from the sudden sound and retreats immediately, fearing for her own life in there. The young man threw the teapot on the floor, also destroying the pocket watch that was on the dining table. Facing the shocked and paralyzed advisor, the protagonist simply smiles and says his hand just slipped. He remembers that the advisor is a relative so distant from the Empress that she does not even know of his existence in the palace. With total arrogance, the young man settles into the chair, adopting an imposing posture that shocks the abusive advisor. Sign is completely speechless to see the intimidating glint in the eyes of the prince, who was previously submissive. The young man decides that he will not die a pathetic death like in the book and blames the advisor himself for the mess. He, who always lived as a loser, decides to use his knowledge of the novel to rewrite his own destiny. With an extremely cold gaze, the prince questions his subordinate about the reason he is still standing there. He points directly at the dirt spread around and says in an ordering tone that the bedroom carpet ended up getting dirty. He demands that the man clean everything immediately, showing that he will do anything to survive in that cruel world. After all, the imperial family is treated as an absolute divinity, and all the riches in the world exist only to serve them. Legend has it that only royal members possess special abilities, and the iconic blonde hair that symbolizes divine nobility. Sign thinks with contempt that this applies to all princes, except for the useless seventh heir to the throne. He remembers how the young man is stupid and has a horrible temper, in addition to having black hair considered hideous. The advisor is biting with anger for having spent fortunes on brides only to end up serving such a failed prince. Swallowing his immense pride, Sign kneels before the young man and begins to personally clean the dirt scattered on the floor. Even annoyed at having to scrub the floor, he finishes the cleaning quickly and announces that the service is completed. The moment the advisor says he will leave, the prince purposefully drops another valuable porcelain cup. Sign turns around startled by the noise, and the prince mocks him, telling him to use that as an opportunity to train more. With red eyes and a scary tone of voice, the young man orders him to clean up that new mess faster. Sweating cold, the advisor complains that he is acting very strangely and threatens to tell the Empress everything that happened. The young man is not intimidated, knowing the advisor is too cowardly to speak to her, and decides to teach him a final lesson. He points to the young maid in the corner of the room and orders her with authority to cover her ears immediately. The prince threatens her, saying he will cut off her fingers if she hears even a single word of that confidential conversation. Terrified by the terrible threat, the girl closes her eyes tightly and presses her hands against her ears without hesitation. The young man then approaches the scared advisor and whispers an extremely dark secret directly into his ear. Upon hearing that bombshell revelation, Sign's arrogant expression changes completely to absolute terror. The man turns pale with fear and starts sweating cold, as if he were staring at the very ghost of death in front of him. Days later in the castle courtyard, the maids gossip that the prince has been acting very bizarrely lately. One of them confesses, trembling, that he has become much scarier and fears she won't survive working in that palace for long. Another servant tries to comfort her, saying that at least the prince has not been leaving his luxurious quarters lately. At that moment, one of the maids reminds Anna that she should already be in the royal office fulfilling her cleaning duty. Meanwhile, in the luxurious office, the young man relaxes, reading calmly near the window and admiring the beautiful day outside. He drinks his hot tea, satisfied by pretending well to be the spoiled prince, causing all the servants to avoid him out of fear. The protagonist celebrates that Sign has stopped bothering him, sparing the young man from having to throw another teapot at his head. His tranquility exists because he knows he still has 1 year until the start of the official story, and 3 years before his death. He remembers with nostalgia when he found the book Dark Hitter in the library and read it hundreds of times because he loved that story, knowing that the arrival of the real protagonist will still take a while. He decides to just relax and enjoy his new luxurious life. He observes the blue sky, thinking it would be wonderful to have wings to fly freely and appreciate that beautiful landscape from above. Suddenly, a violent and mysterious pain crosses his entire body, causing the young man to lose lose his breath suddenly. The pain is so intense that it makes him lose his strength, causing the porcelain cup to slip from his hand and shatter on the floor. Desperate, he feels an absurd burning inside, without understanding the reason for suffering like that out of nowhere. He agonizes, feeling his entire body burn in flames, realizing that this pain is very different from what he felt in the past. Anna knocks on the office door asking for permission to clean, while the young man begs, mentally, for help in agony. Without receiving any answer, the servant opens the door slowly and sighs with relief to realize that the feared prince is not there. But her relief disappears quickly when she looks at the floor and finds the shards of the expensive cup scattered about. She crouches down to pick up the pieces, lamenting the waste of that valuable dishware that could feed her family. Suddenly, she hears a strange noise coming from behind the office curtains and turns around, intrigued, to investigate. The girl is shocked to see a red-eyed crow staring at her fixedly in the middle of that very luxurious office. The crow descends to the floor, while the maid approaches with her broom in her hand, trying to understand how the bird got in there. Very carefully, she takes the crow in her lap and says affectionately that it needs to leave because a very cruel man lives there. The bird falls into complete panic on looking at itself closely and realizing that its voice has turned into a simple crow's squawk. He realizes, terrified, that in some bizarre way he has ceased to be Prince Ran-Aberon and has turned into a black animal. Anna says she would love to take care of it, but knows that they will both die if the cruel crown prince discovers the crow there. The young man tries to scream desperately, ordering her not to let him go, but the girl just holds him firmly toward the open window. Without hesitating, the maid throws the bird from the top of the castle tower, making the young man plummet toward the ground in total panic. He screams in terror, feeling the speed of the fall, and believes faithfully that he will be crushed if he hits the forest floor. Desperate to survive, the young man tries to understand what he needs to do and wonders if he should just flap his wings. He focuses all his willpower on flapping his wings, screaming in his mind that he refuses to die in such a stupid way. The young man flaps his black wings with all his energy, while he falls in freefall toward the forest trees. Surprised, he feels the wind push his body upward and realizes, intrigued, that he has finally managed to control flight. The young man is excited to see that he is really flying through the blue sky, but soon worries about whether he will be able to return to his human body. Night falls over the immense imperial palace, bringing with it the striking and mysterious sight of the three-colored moons in the sky. Fortunately, he manages to regain his human form and decides to test the transformation a few more times to be sure. The young man is fascinated to realize that now he possesses the incredible ability to transform into a crow whenever he wants. He wonders if this is a curse from that crow from the first day, since this power never existed in the original story. Even without understanding the origin of this power, the young man closes the window, knowing he needs to hide this secret from everyone in the palace. He reflects that an unprecedented ability like this, which was not in the original book, can ruin the entire course of the history. The young man suspects his power is linked to Manus, but is interrupted by a servant warning that the ritual is about to begin. The young crown prince prepares himself psychologically, knowing very well that the long-awaited day has finally arrived. This sacred ritual occurs every month and serves as a succession test, although the seventh prince is never considered a rival. He feels a huge difference when experiencing that personally, needing to sit way at the end of that gigantic table. His blonde brothers are so brilliant and imposing that they make the poor black-haired prince look like a mere crow. He endures the mocking gaze, while the young hare sitting in front of him starts provoking him without any shame. That arrogant one is the 17th-year-old prince named Selos, who completely despises his own older brother. Selos loses his patience and slams on the table in annoyance, shouting aggressively to know if his brother suddenly went deaf. But the first princess puts her hand on his shoulder and reprimands him, saying not to create problems in front of the emperor himself. The young man observes his brothers and realizes that they are organized at the table following strictly the order of royal classification. He remembers that the lighter the heir's hair, the greater his control over Manus, which is the power of this world. In contrast, the original prince was born with totally dark hair, being the only member of royalty without any power. However, the peak of control of this sacred power within the entire empire belongs, without any doubt, to one single person. At that instant, firm footsteps start to echo through the great hall, announcing the arrival of the most imposing figure of that empire. Everyone bows immediately when the majestic emperor enters the hall, emanating an aura of power and absolute leadership. The emperor settles into his imposing throne and demands, without beating around the bush, that the measurement ritual start quickly. Without wasting time, he approaches an ancient bluish stone slab that was left as a sacred inheritance by the very first emperor. The emperor places his hand on the magic artifact that serves to measure, with precision, the amount of power of each user. The measurement is simple and reveals the user's strength according to the distance emitted by the object manages to reach. The young man watches, impressed, to see the strong blue light cover the entire table, confirming the emperor's absurd level of power. The emperor removes his hand from the shining stone and challenges, coldly, any of the heirs who wish to test their strength. While most hesitate in the face of the challenge, the protagonist just observes everything in absolute silence, so as not to attract attention. Suddenly, the first prince stands up with pride and accepts his father's challenge, volunteering to take the test. The young man knows that traditionally only the first heir participates, since positions of power rarely undergo changes. He does this periodically in front of all the members of royalty to show off his huge amount of accumulated power. The main objective of this test is to show everyone who really rules there and define who will be the next emperor in fact. But in the middle of the process, the first prince makes an expression of extreme agony and starts spitting blood suddenly. The second prince stands up in absolute shock upon seeing his brother stagger in pain while trying to stand at the table. Despair takes over the royal hall while everyone starts to scream in terror, asking to call a doctor urgently. In the middle of all that general chaos, the protagonist is the only one in the room who understands exactly what is happening there. He knows very well that the first heir is about to die after coughing up a frightening amount of blood throughout his body. The young man realizes with extreme seriousness that the main events of the book he loves so much have finally started to happen. This magical energy is an exclusive power of the imperial lineage, but each member inherits a totally different ability. The first prince manipulates water with extreme ease, while his second brother possesses total control over fire. The result of today's test was already foreseen, since the young man knew that the heir's strength would cover only half of that table. Everything seemed to make sense in his head, since there were still 6 entire months until that terrible incident happened. However, he panics to note that the first prince's death was brought forward inexplicably by half a year in history. He also questions how his own useless prince body managed to gain the rare ability to turn into a crow. The young man is startled to realize that a totally new power emerged right after his arrival and fears it is not a coincidence. Later, the young man enters the second prince's room hidden, knowing that that blonde young man possesses absurd brute strength. The blonde-haired prince smiles mockingly upon seeing the intruder, thinking it was an assassin, but sees it as only his brother. The protagonist responds calmly and ironically, saying that if he were a real assassin, the blonde brother would already be dead on the floor. The blonde brother is in complete shock upon realizing that the prince without powers managed to invade his room without leaving traces. The first prince is furious in his royal quarters, breaking several expensive objects in a fit of uncontrollable rage. He throws a violent punch against the glass mirror, lemming that everything seemed perfect and normal on the morning of that same day. But upon continuing to strike, he is suddenly startled to feel that his sacred power is acting in a very strange way. The man collapses to his knees on the floor, agonizing in pain while his body shakes violently because of internal burning. He realizes, horrified, that he feels his body burn in flames whenever he tries to use Manus and fears never being able to use it again. He falls into total denial, shouting that it is impossible, for he is the first crown prince and the future ruler of the empire. empire. Trying to calm down, the prince holds the hookah tightly, repeating to himself that he is far superior to the other brothers. A mysterious voice rises in the darkness of the room, advising the crown prince to drop the hookah if he wants to stay alive. The prince turns around, startled by the sudden presence, and asks aggressively who dared to invade his private quarters. He demands to know how the intruder managed to get in there, and the black-haired young man replies calmly that he just climbed up the wall. The prince does not believe a word, but the young man says that it does not matter and points to the window at the top of that high tower. The intruder asks how he is feeling, knowing that the palace doctors lied about the hare's real state of health. The first prince lets out an ironic mocking laugh, trying to hide the terror he is feeling in the face of that direct question. He starts to laugh loudly in a manic and forced way, trying to recover his imposing posture in the face of that unwanted brother. The protagonist observes him with boredom, commenting that the crown prince used his head a little more than appearances indicated. The hare accuses his brother of having poisoned him on purpose to use the antidote as blackmail when he takes the royal throne. He advances with anger, calling his brother a fool for believing that a ridiculous plan like that would work against him in the palace. The black-haired young man says coldly that in just 1 week the prince will beg for death, expelling blood through his eyes. Upon hearing that such a frightening statement, the crown prince freezes with fear, unable to make any defense reaction. The protagonist sits comfortably on the sofa and clarifies firmly that he used no tricks or traps against him. He explains that the prince's body will deteriorate quickly until death and confesses that he still does not know who the real author is. But the young man makes it very clear that listening carefully to his advice from that exact moment is of extreme importance. The protagonist emphasizes seriously that conversation is the last and only chance to save the desperate hare's life. He leaves there flying like a crow, satisfied to know that the older brother is cowardly and easy to manipulate like in the book. The young man knows that he will be able to use the first prince however he wants, facilitating his survival plans in the empire. Flying in the middle of the rain, he realizes how convenient his new crow power is, which allows him to travel anywhere. The young man takes advantage of the fact that he is already out of his room and decides to use the rainy night to explore a little more of the imperial palace. The bird flies quickly, cutting through the heavy storm that falls over the great city of the empire under the dark cloak of that night. The next morning, the sun shines brightly over the beautiful imperial palace, bringing a new atmosphere of tranquility for everyone. Outside the room, the maid Anna is very worried because the prince has not eaten anything and has given no signs of life for 2 days. The girl enters total panic, imagining that the prince has died and that she will be executed coldly for the crime of royal assassination. Terrified, she starts to pound on the wooden door, shouting desperately to know if the prince is okay in there. She opens the door in a hurry and finds the prince calmly leaving the room, who asks with boredom the reason for so much noise. The servant ends up slipping clumsily on the floor and falls face first, spreading all the meal she was carrying on the silver tray. To make matters worse, the hot soup ends up dirtying the prince's boot directly, leaving the girl paralyzed with terror on the floor. The young man observes the dirt on his shoe with a completely expressionless look while the servant trembles with fear at his feet. The young maid begs desperately for forgiveness, saying that she just wanted to know if the prince was in good health. She cries copiously without stopping to apologize while the young man gets annoyed because she is making such a big scene over nothing. The young man pressures her with an intimidating look, asking how she intends to take responsibility for dirtying the floor and his boot, but he decides to ignore the problem and orders coldly that she clean everything in 5 minutes and disappear from there as quickly as possible. The protagonist moves away, satisfied by imposing strict rules, ensuring that the maid never bothers him in his quarters again. A month passes since the incident at the ritual, and the young man's room appears filled with with piles of magic books scattered on the floor. During this time, a dangerous rumor starts to spread through the empire, stating that the first prince has lost all his powers. For the other brothers, that gossip represented a golden opportunity to try to take control and the line of succession. To stifle the rumors, the first prince begs the emperor to bring forward the famous and important royal hunting competition. Mounted on his horse, the young man notes that the events are following the book, but worries if the real protagonist has also been affected. Today is the day of the royal hunt, and the young man plans to meet with the protagonist to deliver an important item and wait for the right moment. Suddenly, the arrogant eighth prince approaches mounted on his horse, calling his brother a useless insect in a mocking way. He mocks, saying that the black horse matches the brother's dark personality, while the young man worries about his impulsiveness. The young man decides to ignore his brother's provocations, focusing on the important event that awaits him. But the eighth prince is furious with that. The black-haired prince mounts the black horse and thinks that the animal matches him much more than a golden horse. He looks ahead with seriousness and sighs with relief to realize that they have finally managed to reach the destination. The young man observes the immense entrance to the imperial forest while preparing for what is about to happen there. He spots the imposing Tower of the Beginning, where the opening ritual of the hunt is usually held every year in the empire. The young man remembers that the competition will begin right after the first prince finishes his part in the sacred ritual. He knows that, in fact, the entire event is nothing more than a great cruel political show to impress all the nobility. The emperor orders coldly that the first prince prepare quickly to start the important strength test. Prince Dido approaches and asks in a sarcastic way if the older brother has already thought about what his wish will be. He refers to the special request that the winner of the hunt can make directly to the emperor at the end of the big day. The hare walks toward the altar to show his magical power in front of all the nobles who watch attentively. The nobles start to gossip in whispers about the recent rumors that something terrible would have happened to the prince. The first prince sweats cold and hopes desperately that the useless brother did not lie about the magical cure. Protagonist just observes everything from afar with an enigmatic smile on his face, knowing exactly what is going to happen. The hare threatens mentally to kill the young man in the most painful way possible if he discovers that everything was a trick. The protagonist notes the extreme rigidity of his brother and thinks ironically so that he not get so nervous with the test. The young man knows that if the first prince followed his orders to the letter, something very interesting is about to occur. Suddenly, an immense wave of bright blue energy starts to explode from the hare's body with absurd force. The blast of power spreads like a violent hurricane, scaring the crowd of nobles watching the spectacle. The power continues to expand in an uncontrolled way, generating a magical storm that sweeps the entire royal courtyard. Several people are thrown backward by the force of the wind, while they scream desperately to get out of the whirlpool. The guards order immediately that everyone retreat to avoid that people be injured by that destructive energy, even suffering. The first prince's all his willpower, reminding himself of his position as hare. He clenches his teeth with blood running from his mouth, while he strives to the maximum to endure that terrible pain. He shouts furiously that he is the only hare destined to rule the entire empire, and releases a massive amount of power. All that magical energy suddenly takes the scary form of a gigantic sea monster that emerges in the skies. The giant creature of water dissolves slowly into a beautiful and shining bluish rain that starts to fall over the courtyard. The strong magical storm finally dissipates and leaves an atmosphere of pure admiration and silence among those present. The nobles watch that scene completely open, mouthed in amaze by the incredible demonstration of royal power. Even the most experienced warriors admit that the energy of the imperial family is really something out of the ordinary. The entire crowd starts to scream with joy and cheer the hare who raises his fist, celebrating his great victory. The story shows the flashback in which the protagonist offers a dark stone, ordering the hare to deposit his power in it. The young man explains calmly that the object serves to absorb the polluted power that is consuming his body from within. He warns without beating around the bush that he has no interest in saving the brother's life if he prefers to refuse help and die. Back to the present, the young man celebrates having used that legendary item ahead of time to gain a valuable ally at court. The advisor reappears, trembling and tired under the weight of the huge black backpack, paying his respects with difficulty. The man warns that he brought the heavy suitcase exactly as ordered, and the protagonist comments on the delay of the journey. With a scary look, the crown prince questions if the useless subordinate touched anything inside that bag. The man complains mentally for having survived the wild horse that he himself chose on purpose to injure the hare. A loud sound of a trumpet starts to echo through the valley, officially announcing the beginning of the imperial hunting activities. The emperor raises his imposing hand and declares in a loud voice the beginning of that year's traditional hunting competition. All the knights and warriors prepare in a row, ready to advance in a dash toward the dense forest. The participants run excitedly, dreaming of victory, while others know that the royal family always wins the tournament. The protagonist decides to maintain discretion so as not to attract attention. Since winning that tournament is not important to him now, the young man plans to use the event only to find the former commander of the Imperial Knights and recruit his strength. The bespectacled young man comments, amazed, to his lord, saying that the power displayed by the hare seemed like the strength of a god. The Duke confesses, smiling, that he felt that the emperor's real intention was just to intimidate and break the pride of the nobles. The helper enters total panic and begs for his lord to only say such dangerous words when the two of them are alone. The experienced warrior says he knows very well how to stay alive in that court full of intrigues and constant dangers. The narration reveals that the immense forest where the hunt happens is strictly divided into 3 large different areas. The map indicates that the small animal area is near the entrance, while the dangerous beast zone is deep inside. The young man remembers that in the original story, the Duke offered a golden fox to the Emperor, but he does not know where to find it. This is the real reason he explored the entire immense forest in the form of a crow to map the locations of the beasts. He deduces that the fox lives near a lake in the southwest, based on the information that the Duke washed his hands there after the hunt. The prince decides to hurry to get there before the Duke and feels his intelligent horse understands every word said. He feels relieved because his advisor brought the suitcase with precious stones that he plans to deliver to the Duke himself. The black horse runs at high speed, making the heavy bag of stones balance dangerously on the young man's back. Suddenly, the horse brakes brusquely, almost throwing the young prince far away in the middle of the forest trees. Startled by the sudden stop, the young man tries to recover his balance and questions the horse about the reason for stopping out of nowhere. The horse shakes his head negatively when the prince asks if he is feeling sick or tired of running so much. The young hare insists, asking if the intelligent animal by chance spotted some dangerous wild beast nearby. A terrible suspicion starts to cross the young man's mind, making him widen his eyes in total disbelief there. He questions if the backpack is too heavy, and the freeloading horse shakes his head, confirming without the slightest shame. The young man shouts, annoyed, saying that other horses pull heavy wagons, while he complains about carrying just a backpack. He threatens to leave the animal without food if he continues acting with such arrogance, and refusing to follow the path. The horse beats his paw on the ground with full force, showing that he does not care at all about his owner's silly threats. The animal simply runs away in a dash, leaving the young prince abandoned in the middle of the woods, carrying the heavy bag. The young man observes the horse fleeing and realizes that he is in deep trouble for having been left totally alone in that forest. Meanwhile, the Duke walks through the forest thinking that hunting wolves and deer should be a very simple task for him. His young helper comments that luck does not seem to be on their side today, since they could not find any prey. The experienced Duke laments in silence that he is getting old, and that even the greatest warriors cannot fight against time. The bespectacled helper asks him not to speak like that and guarantees with sincere admiration that the Lord is already a living legend of the Empire. He recalls the Duke's countless military glories as commander, but the old warrior defines himself as just a retiree. The Duke questions the helper if he has ever seen the imperial family up close, and the young man confesses that he only observed them from a distance. The warrior says that he will only truly understand when he faces them directly and sees who really rules that empire. Story shows a flashback of the past, where the Duke's father explained that the royal lineage rules the empire like living gods. The old lord asked his son to take his place in the future and to be proud of loyally serving the grandiose imperial family. He showed with pride the huge fleet of merchants that their family possessed to provide valuable resources to royalty. But the pleasant conversation between father and son was brutally interrupted when the carriage started to shake violently. The nobleman demands, annoyed, to know what is happening, and the coachman apologizes, saying something got stuck under the wheels. The scared coachman begs his lord to go back inside the carriage while he cleans that dirt himself. The man looks at the floor and finds the lifeless body of a poor child stretched out in a tragic way on the pavement. A large amount of fresh blood runs from the heavy wooden wheels, revealing the brutality of the fatal accident. The nobleman discovers that the victim was just a small orphan accused of trying to steal offerings destined for the sacred temple. He realizes that absurd tragedy with orphan children is an extremely common event in the day of the capital. The young and innocent son asks his father what is happening and says happily that he also wishes to go out to see the movement. With a tone of despair and authority, the father shouts rudely, ordering the boy to remain inside the luxurious vehicle. The boy is extremely scared and confused by his father's sudden shouting, who tries at all costs to protect him from the scene. The man hides the terrible truth and states coldly that that is nothing important, to spare his son from that pain. Back to the present, the Duke remembers that sad memory, thinking that the poor victim was not even 10 years old. He laments that the boy was incinerated and wonders if there is so much darkness hidden behind that noble empire. The bespectacled helper calls his attention, saying they need to hurry to save the honor and prestige of the Duke's family. The experienced nobleman apologizes for the delay and reveals, smiling, that he knows a secret location where the rare fox usually appears. The protagonist runs, exhausted, carrying the heavy bag, and swears he will turn his lazy horse into barbecue at the palace. He realizes that the weight prevents him from turning into a crow and fears losing the Duke's trail if he continues running so slowly. The prince remembers that even the small animal zone can be very dangerous with wild beasts appearing suddenly. Suddenly, a bush starts to move strangely, making the prince stop immediately and prepare for an attack. He curses his own laziness for not having brought any weapon to defend himself from that threat lurking in the shadows. While thinking of fleeing, the prince throws a rock toward the noise and ends up spotting the young bespectacled helper there. The thrown rock hits the poor helper squarely in the face, interrupting his speech in an extremely painful way there. Upon noticing the exotic color of the boy's hair, the protagonist enters total shock, realizing that he has just injured the wrong person. The Duke hears the noise from afar and runs, very worried, shouting his helper's name in the middle of the dense forest. The crown prince observes the boy's bluish hair and realizes, scared, that he has just knocked out the Duke's right-hand man. The poor, bespectacled helper named Talon faints on the lawn with his face bloodied after suffering the surprise rock blow. The protagonist enters complete despair upon realizing that he has just created a huge problem with the strongest nobleman in the court. He remembers that the Duke is a legendary war hero and the former commander of all the strongest knights in the kingdom. The young man remembers that the warrior will become the future mentor of the real protagonist, who will one day turn the empire upside down. Hidden behind the trunk, the young man knows very well that he cannot be discovered by the furious Duke in any hypothesis there. His initial plan was to accuse the experienced Duke of trying to steal royal prey to be able to punish him unfairly. He intended to force the warrior to carry the heavy backpack full of magic stones during the entire royal hunting competition. The protagonist bites his lip with pure worry upon seeing his perfect plan go down the drain in just a second due to pure bad luck. The Duke examines the fallen rock and deduces immediately that the heavy object was thrown intentionally by someone hidden. He starts to suspect that the attack, in fact, was a botched assassination attempt against himself in the middle of the forest. The young helper finally starts to regain consciousness little by little and tries to speak with his master, who runs to help him. The warrior asks the boy to stay calm and tell in detail if he can remember any detail about the aggressor. The young man enters panic, knowing that if they spread gossip that he tried to injure the Duke's assessor, his head will be in danger. The injured boy forces his memory in a tired way, trying to reveal what he managed to see before receiving that rock hit. The prince looks wide-eyed in pure despair, trying to come up with an urgent way to silence the boy before he speaks. By pure luck for the protagonist, the young Talon ends up fainting again from exhaustion. Before he can pronounce the culprit, he lets out a long sigh of relief upon seeing the boy pass out, thanking mentally for not having been reported yet. Suddenly, the Duke hears a small noise in the foliage and turns around with a murderous look toward the prince's hiding place. The experienced nobleman focuses his sharp gaze toward the trees, confirming that he detected the presence of the secret invader there. The young man takes advantage of the distraction to shoot into flight, running with all his strength far from that place. The Duke draws his sword and tells the injured boy to wait while he runs to capture the culprit in the forest. The tree branches shake violently, while the relentless hunt begins in the middle of the dense, imperial vegetation. The prince feels his legs fail from extreme exhaustion and complains that the weight of the suitcase is killing his breath in the race. He tries to calm down, thinking that he has already run enough to easily throw off a simple elderly warrior like the Duke, but the old man appears, jumping right behind him like a monster of speed, shocking the young man, who thought he was already retired. The Duke demands in a loud voice that he reveal his secret identity, and the prince realizes he will be caught if he does not come up with something quick. He hesitates whether to drop the precious backpack to turn into a crow and deeply laments, not having his fast horse at that moment. Without wanting to give up, he focuses all his accumulated magical energy to try to increase his running speed. A wind explosion throws the prince's body forward, causing him to shoot at high speed like a blur. The experienced Duke is surprised by the opponent's sudden start and notes, intrigued, that his silhouette seemed to change. The nobleman strikes the air annoyed, lamenting that his vision is no longer as sharp and precise as in his youth. The warrior lands in an empty clearing and looks around, completely disappointed for having lost the fast invader's trail. The hero hare feels his body much lighter and wonders if he ended up transforming involuntarily into a bird there. He hears the clear sound of hooves hitting the ground and wonders, surprised, if that mischievous black horse decided to return. Upon opening his eyes and focusing his gaze on his reflection, he starts to suspect a bizarre possibility about his real form. The young man realizes he did not turn into a crow, but into a most beautiful and strong horse, running majestically through that beautiful hill. On the other side of the valley, Prince Dido observes the huge carcass of the creature and lets out a murmur of pure amazement in front of the monster. He questions, impressed, if his older brother really was the hero who managed to hunt and defeat the terrible monster. The two brothers with golden hair face the giant carcass of the saber-toothed bear fallen lifeless on the forest floor. The younger one congratulates him on the victory guaranteed and asks if the older brother has already thought about the wish he will ask the emperor. With a dark smile stamped on his face, the crown prince confirms that he already has the perfect plan traced in his mind. Meanwhile, the protagonist returns to his human form and sits under the shade of a large tree to be able to rest. The young man holds his head with both hands in total despair, realizing that things have become extremely bad for him. He looks at his empty hands and laments deeply upon noting that he ended up losing the precious backpack during the flight. The prince starts to roll on the lawn, crying from frustration for having lost precisely the most important item for his plan. He throws himself onto his back on the forest floor, shedding tears of exhaustion and irritation in front of that terrible day of royal hunting. He decides to breathe deeply and stop complaining, knowing that the only solution now is to redo the entire path back to look for it. Back at the location of the attack, the injured Talon finally sits down slowly and asks if his esteemed master has returned. The Duke asks, worried, if the young man is already feeling better, and the boy replies that he still feels a little dizzy. The old warrior feels very ashamed for having lost the invader from sight and laments being getting too old. He points, intrigued, to the backpack full of mysterious stones that he found thrown in the middle of the grass during the pursuit. Talon examines the luxurious backpack closely and is confused, without understanding why it is completely full of common stones. Hidden behind a tree nearby, the crown prince sweats nervously, hoping that they think everything was a joke. Suddenly, the prince decides to appear, shouting, surprised, pointing directly at the backpack that was with the warriors. The green-haired young man points, scared, upon recognizing the seventh prince, while the duke himself is surprised by that. The two warriors bow immediately on the ground to pay the proper formal greetings to the heir of the royal family. The duke questions respectfully if the object belongs to the prince, and the young man feigns relief, confirming he was looking for it. With a dark and intimidating look, the heir changes his tone of voice and questions in a harsh way, "They stole his item." The veteran gets tense with the serious accusation and explains quickly that he only found the object thrown in the middle of the lawn. The young man warns that anyone would lie not to lose their hand, and the duke swears by the honor of his family that he is telling the truth. The crown prince notices the bruised face of the young helper, and the duke replies, nervous, that it was just a small accident. The injured boy remains in absolute silence, trembling nervously in front of the imposing and frightening presence of the prince. At that moment, the young man remembers the scene in which he shot the big rock against the boy's face and tries to hide the guilt. The young helper tries to speak something directly with the prince, making the atmosphere between them stay even more tense there. In a violent way, the young man advances and holds the boy by the hair, shocking the duke, who did not expect such an aggressive attitude. The crown prince complains with arrogance that a mere commoner dared to interrupt in an insolent way a conversation of royalty. He asks in a threatening tone if the duke can lend him a sword so that he himself solves that annoying problem. The poor boy trembles with absolute terror with wide eyes, feeling that his own life runs imminent danger there. The duke apologizes for the error of his helper, and the prince smiles, praising the admirable loyalty of the experienced warrior. The young man thinks that the man acts like a true imperial dog who accepts humiliations silently without even sketching any reaction. The prince provokes, saying in a cruel way that the duke's son will also grow up to become one more submissive dog of the empire. The duke remembers the scared look of his young son in the past and feels an enormous fury growing inside his chest. The young man delivers the heavy backpack to the warrior, saying that that meeting was a work of destiny and that he trusts them today. With a dark look, he orders in a frightening way that the duke protect that item with his own life without ever losing it. The crown prince asks severely if the man understood the orders, and the duke remains in silence holding the backpack. The warrior lowers his head with seriousness and replies that he will obey faithfully all the glorious orders given by the prince. The heir says goodbye, wishing a good hunt for the two of them, and celebrates content by feeling his own body very light. He admits mentally that he acted in a horrible way with the two warriors, but knows he needed to do that to plant a seed. The helper apologizes for what happened, and the duke warns that he was lucky to come out alive, recommending that they return to rest. Talon comments suddenly that he managed to remember a very important detail about the invader who threw the big rock. The boy reveals with seriousness that the culprit for having thrown the object against him in the middle of the forest was the seventh prince. The experienced Duke interrupts the helper's speech in a harsh way and orders that he not say one more word about it. In the original story, the Duke would rebel only in the following year after suffering with the tragic and painful loss of his only son. The young man plans to bring forward the warrior's rebellion to this year and knows he needed to give a strong stimulus to provoke that. Meanwhile, the arrogant blonde hair reveals to his ally the wish he intends to ask directly for the emperor. He plans to clear the entire area near the sacred temple, eliminating the poor people of the capital as if they were mere insects. Protagonist observes everything from afar, knowing that the tragic destiny of the rebel Duke is already completely traced in history. The old general walks carrying the heavy backpack on his back while he reflects deeply on his role in that empire. The young man knows that the warrior will start a great revolt against the imperial family, because that is his true destiny there. The sun starts to set on the horizon, illuminating the great mountains and the dense trees of the immense forest of the imperial palace. Hidden in the bushes, the prince makes sure that no one saw him land in the form of a bird, not to expose his ability. He feels a little guilty for the evilness with the two warriors, but soon remembers that now he assumed the role of the great villain. The young man plans his next steps for when the tournament ends, but is surprised upon spotting a person in front of him. The empire's first princess appears walking elegantly and comments that it is very unusual to see her brother walking alone there. The young man gets tense upon running into the dangerous crown princess and wonders what she would be doing in that isolated location. He pays the proper formal greetings, but she says to dispense with formalities since both share the same royal blood. The woman asks the reason for him being on foot, and the prince makes up the excuse that he only decided to walk to breathe fresh air. The princess changes her facial expression completely and states coldly that she cannot understand that answer of his. With a piercing look, the princess questions seriously the reason for the brother to lie to his own family. The young prince swallows dryly and tries to disguise his nervousness by asking what she really means by that. The princess explains that she saw a horse without an owner in the forest and her servants confirmed that the animal belonged to him. He invents coldly that he ordered the death of the horse, claiming that disobedient animals deserve to die without pity. The young man kneels, feigning repentance, and asks for forgiveness, saying he acted on impulse out of shame of losing the animal. She asks the brother to raise his head, saying, smiling, that she does not want it to seem that she is punishing him there. The woman says she is happy for his safety and warns generously that he can ask for another horse when he needs. The young man observes the sister moving away, thinking that she is a person very difficult to deal with for hiding her thoughts. He questions, intrigued, why she leaves in silence and suspects if her secret ability does not work on him. Night falls over the tents of the imperial hunting camp, while a tense conversation starts in one of the cabins. The doctor tries to understand the boy's absurd story and questions if he really tripped over a rock and fell. The professional comments, surprised, that he has never seen anyone get injured so much in such a silly way in an official hunting competition. The Duke asks about the recovery, and the doctor replies that the internal injury is serious, demanding a week of total rest. Talon despairs upon knowing that he will be left out of the tournament, but his lord puts his hand on his shoulder, recognizing the loyalty. The experienced warrior orders him to rest until the end of the event, guaranteeing that he and Jack will take care of everything else. The young helper smiles happily and promises with excitement that he will do his best to rest a lot and fulfill the order. The Duke mocks, saying that having a vacation in the middle of the hunt is unprecedented, and Talon jokes that his big dream is to live without working. The nobleman laughs loudly and promises to win the hunt to ask for a gold mine to the emperor and make his faithful friend's dream come true. Later, the candle illuminates the room silently while the young helper sleeps deeply under the tent roof. Talon appears snoring in a comical and relaxed way, making the most of his new and well-deserved time off in the competition. Suddenly, a mysterious hand leaves a small sealed scroll right next to the boy's head, who continues sleeping. The crown prince smiles in a dark way, repeating that the Duke acted like a loyal dog who ignores the danger of his ally. Sitting in the darkness, the old Duke holds his head with pain upon remembering the cruel provocation made by the rebel prince. Unable to manage to sleep with his agitated thoughts, he decides to leave his cabin to take some fresh air. Suddenly, he widens his eyes in complete shock upon spotting something totally unexpected outside the camp. The experienced warrior lowers his head, confused upon finding himself facing the mysterious backpack left right at the entrance of his tent. He notes that the strange stones inside the heavy suitcase start to glow and to vibrate in a frightening way. With the backpack on his back, the man walks determinedly through the forest under the light of the 3 moons, planning to visit the temple. The Duke recalls the day he explained to his young son about the sacred savior who descended from the skies to end the chaos. The small boy smiles, excited, saying that he already read everything about the legendary divine figure of Sierra the Great in his books. The father told with pride that that incarnation of a god possessed mysterious powers and had defeated all the war enemies. He explained that the great god unified the lands, founding the grandiose empire and the royal family themselves that they serve today. The old hero focuses his gaze on the horizon, thinking of his precious son, who has always been his greatest and only treasure. He asked his son to follow in his footsteps as a warrior and to become the sword of greatest pride of the entire royal family. Back to the present, the man complains about the absurd weight of the suitcase, wondering why he decided to carry those stones. He hesitates whether he does this out of pure loyalty or fear until he is interrupted by the loud sounding of a horn in the forest. The experienced warrior looks, surprised, toward the mountains and recognizes the specific sound of the empire's sacred trumpet. The nobles of the camp get shocked by the incessant noise of beasts that echoed through the entire forest during the night. Several rumors arise, suggesting that the blonde hair defeated all the monsters, ending the great tournament prematurely. The announcer declares officially that the 4-day tournament ended in just 1 night, thanks to the prince's record. The first prince with blonde hair is solemnly declared the great and undisputed winner of the hunting competition. The powerful emperor congratulates personally his oldest son, who thanks him by making a deep formal bow. Following the imperial tradition, the king orders the crown prince to announce in front of everyone the wish he wants to see fulfilled. The curious crowd starts to whisper and recall the great requests that were made in the competitions of past years. The hare explains that several beggars are occupying the area around the sacred temple and threatening the safety of the location. With an evil smile, he wishes to restore the beauty of the region and eliminate once and for all that annoying mess in the courtyard. The Duke enters complete despair upon hearing the cruel proposal, knowing that that will result in a terrible massacre there. He visualizes immediately the terrible scene of dozens of imperial soldiers massacring mercilessly the poor people. The blonde crown prince asks formally for special permission to start the cruel cleaning of that area of the temple. The Duke recalls his son's voice from the past calling for him, while panic and blood dominate his thoughts. In the midst of the darkness, he manages to hear his son's sweet and distant voice calling for him again in a desperate way. He draws his heavy sword, knowing that he always acted like a loyal dog, but refuses to see his son suffer the same. The experienced Duke advances with his weapon drawn, scaring the entire crowd of nobles who watched the event. He observes the sharp blade, apologizing in silence to his dear son for having taken that extreme decision. Talon opens his eyes slowly, still half dizzy from sleep, trying to speak something while observing the environment around him. The black-haired crown hare appears hanging upside down, staring at the boy in a quite intimidating way. The helper falls from the bed in a fright, trying to greet the prince in a clumsy way, while the young man tells him to calm down. The prince prescribes olive leaves for the pain, and the scared boy questions respectfully the reason for that visit. The young man ignores the question and questions coldly, if the boy has no idea of the terrible situation the Duke got himself into. Young Talon widens his eyes, confused, upon hearing the mention of the important closing ceremony of that day. The prince orders him to run immediately to the location, and the boy shoots in a dash toward the great courtyard. The young helper pushes the soldiers with difficulty, trying in every way to make a way through that great crowd. He finally manages to get past the guard barrier, but freezes with terror upon seeing the scene that happens right in front of him. He sees his beloved master kneeling in the center of the courtyard, in front of the armed blonde hare, surrounded by several royal guards. The first prince with blonde hair shouts extremely enraged, demanding to know what the Duke thinks he is doing. The old Duke declares in a loud voice that his noble family served loyally and protected royalty for over 1,000 years there. He states with seriousness that his lineage is much more willing to deal peacefully with the people near the temple. The warrior makes his humble request directly to the emperor, shocking the blonde prince who watches without being able to act. The emperor accepts the request, honoring the immense loyalty of the old general, and the blonde-haired gnashes his teeth in pure anger. However, the king warns, smiling, that he finds it comical to see that the duke's loyalty led him to block the will of the royal family itself. The first blonde prince releases an immense storm of energy and shouts, asking if he thought there would be clemency. He states furious that the old general lost his mind when challenging royalty, and that offense deserves immediate execution. The experienced duke closes his eyes, accepting his destiny, and declares that he will pay with his own life for interrupting the hunt. Talon screams desperately from pain upon seeing his master about to be executed in the middle of the courtyard by that fatal magic. The protagonist observes the scene in silence, thinking, satisfied, that the great revolt finally started in a perfect way. Far from there, near a river in the forest, a mysterious young man wearing a brown cape fills a water canteen calmly. Suddenly, the water starts to float and to act in a magical and bizarre way around the canteen, leaving the young man suspicious. The young man in a cape looks, intrigued, at the magical energy that flows from the water, without understanding the reason for it acting like that. A colossal blue explosion of magical energy rises on the horizon over the forest, revealing that the execution has already started. The narration reveals to us that young man in the forest is none other than Radel, the true protagonist of the book. The old Duke has always been considered a true war hero, commanding the troops and protecting the empire for years. But now he has been reduced to a mere sinner who awaits on his knees the terrible sentence for insulting proud royalty. The first prince with blonde hair raises his hand, declaring solemnly the immediate execution of that rebel warrior. A colossal whirlpool of freezing water forms around the duke, covering his body completely with violence. All the nobility watches the demonstration of strength of royalty in complete silence, knowing that the general will not leave alive from there. Trapped inside the bubble of magic water, the experienced warrior starts to drown, feeling that he can no longer breathe. While sinking into the darkness under the strong pressure, he is surprised suddenly upon noting a silhouette in the middle of that water. The Duke is startled to see the image of his faithful helper suffering and questions himself how the boy ended up there in danger. He remembers the helper's excuse of dizziness and smiles happily upon realizing that the boy is actually well and healthy. The warrior laments his pathetic end, but asks in thought for Talon to take good care of his son after his departure. He notes the imposing presence of the seventh black-haired prince, who seems to observe him in a calm and mysterious way from there. Even drowning, he focuses his vision on the prince's lips, trying to understand the secret message he is saying. With an enigmatic look, the dark-haired young man warns silently that the final moment to die has not yet arrived. Upon reading those enigmatic words, the warrior recovers his pride and shouts in thought that he refuses to die there. The arrogant blonde hair raises his arm again, prepared to shoot the final blow and finish everything once and for all. An immense pillar of bluish light explodes toward the skies, illuminating the entire hunting camp with a colossal energy. The colossal whirlpool of magic water implodes with violence, spreading a strong gust of wind through the entire great valley. In the middle of all that agitation, the precious stones that were inside the heavy backpack start to spread on the floor. The blonde one observes the destruction of his own execution magic and focuses his gaze on the floor, intrigued by what happened. Talon screams in complete despair, while the royal soldiers hold him firmly, preventing the boy from advancing toward the arena. The young heir of black hair observes the entire destruction with extreme seriousness, thinking of the next steps. The small boy writes attentively in his diary until he is suddenly interrupted by a strong glow in the window. He observes, amazed, through the open window, an immense line of bluish energy cross silently the sky. Back to the present, the young man in a brown cape follows with his gaze the strong gust of blue light that crosses the clouds. He runs at high speed, jumping over the forest bushes to try to discover the origin of that pillar. A strong explosion of wind and earth happens in the middle of the valley, revealing the violence of that terrible magical impact. Rattle jumps with agility over a great cliff, focused on reaching the exact location of that mysterious light. The young man in a cape runs toward an immense whirlpool of bluish energy that formed in the center of the empty clearing. He tries to force his vision through the glow, but complains mentally for everything being too blurry in there. The young man continues observing attentively the bluish energy until noting the silhouette of a person trapped in the whirlpool. Without hesitating, he jumps from a great height directly against the immense bubble of magic water to save the person. The young man extends his arm with all his strength, determined to rescue the man who is drowning in the magic bubble. He plunges his hand directly into the strong turbulence of blue energy and managed to grab the victim firmly. With a lot of agility, the young man in a brown cape lands firmly on the grass floor after performing the rescue successfully. Wet from head to toe, he observes the immense clearing, trying to understand if someone witnessed his heroic action. Breathing with a lot of difficulty, the young protagonist lowers his head, frustrated, wondering if he lost the trail. He stands on the edge of the abyss, contemplating the colossal line of light that shines on the distant horizon of the mountains. The young man's eyes glow intensely in the darkness upon realizing the immense strength of that manifestation of royal power. Back to the castle courtyard, young Talon cries inconsolably, whispering his esteemed master's name in tears. He remains motionless in the middle of the field, staring at the remains of the battle while the crowd gossips about the sad end. The emperor declares the end of everything, and his subordinate warns that the hunting closing ceremony will occur at noon. The crowd disperses slowly through the valley while the organizers prepare the great podium for the final award. The first prince cleans the dust from his uniform with disdain, celebrating having eliminated what he called a useless insect. He walks with arrogance among the bowed knights, saying that the lack of rigor attracts fools who do not know their place. The nobles mock the fall of the duke's family, while young Talon remains with his head down, enduring the offenses in the camp. The knights and the nobles start to withdraw from the courtyard, leaving the injured boy completely alone in the middle of the arena. Talon walks with slow steps back to the camp, feeling the enormous weight of having lost his great master and friend. One of the soldiers spits on the young man, calling him a filthy traitor, while the others laugh loudly at his misfortune in the camp. Hidden in the crowd, the crown prince observes the helper's pain, knowing that his heart is totally broken there. The young man enters his cabin silently, while the prince thinks that the young helper will never let himself be defeated there. Talon starts to pick up the pieces of his destroyed wooden bed, trying to organize the space of his empty tent. Suddenly, his gaze comes across that small sealed scroll that was left mysteriously on the earth. He takes the paper with both hands and is extremely surprised to recognize the official coat of arms of his own family there. The letter says that if the young man is reading that, the Duke probably is no longer part of that world of suffering. In the message, the old master asks earnestly for young Talon to take very good care of his son after his departure. The Duke reveals that he senses that he will commit a great error soon, asks the boy to always remember one thing. With his eyes full of tears, the helper reads the part where his master states that none of that is his fault in any way. Talon trembles with emotion upon reading the official declaration of his lord, naming his heir in a definitive way in the letter. The paper slips from his fingers and falls softly on the dry earth of the cabin, while the young man cries in complete silence. He collapses crying on the floor upon discovering that he was named officially as the new temporary leader of the Duke's family. Meanwhile, in the castle, the black-haired prince comments ironically that the blonde brother spent too much energy today. The young man warns that the disease worsened a lot since the hunt, and the blonde hair spits blood. Furious, telling him to shut his mouth, he raises the magic stone and demands clear answers, threatening to kill the hair. If that is not more than a useless trick, the protagonist advises calmly that he must use his power very slowly, so as not to worsen the pain even more. The blonde crown prince prince boils with hatred in silence, swearing to tear his own brother in half as soon as he is cured from there. The young man smiles from the corner, warning that the blonde one only continues alive thanks to the purifying power of that dark stone he received. He withdraws, thinking worriedly about the rumors that young Tallinn would be in a deep coma in the medical camp. The hare questions himself tense if the young man runs a real risk of death, while the image shows the boy's eyes opening. The young helper wakes up confused in an unknown bed and looks at the ceiling, wondering where exactly he finds himself. A servant tries to help the new leader stand up, but the bespectacled young man just asks in a firm way for him to move away from there. The servant says that he has been unconscious for 2 weeks and can faint at any moment. Tallinn warns that he needs to see the young duke and asks, "What is the current situation of the family?" The man reveals that the situation is bad because the business partners and the servants abandoned the family. He explains that the financial situation is terrible and they cannot ask for help due to the incident. While they walk through the hallway, the boy appears and recognizes the bespectacled young man, who is still weak. Tallinn screams worried. Upon seeing the small hare right in front of him in the palace hallway, the small duke asks if he is well, and Tallinn apologizes for having caused so much worry. The boy comments that many problems arose, and that not even the father's funeral has been organized yet. Tallinn listens through the open window to the conversation of 2 men gossiping outside the location. They say that the duke committed that madness and suggest fleeing before they are called traitors. He thinks with regret that the stigma of traitors of the empire will be something impossible to erase from the family. Tallinn calls his servant by name, and the man makes himself available immediately to attend the call. Tallinn orders coldly that they rip the tongues of the gossips outside as punishment. The bespectacled young man asks, with a dark look, if he really will need to repeat that direct order. Intimidated by the implacable posture of the temporary leader, the servant makes a bow and accepts the order. Tallinn surprises everyone by declaring with firmness that they will not hold the funeral of the deceased duke. He explains that the deceased can no longer be considered part of the family and asks for the boy's understanding. The boy questions the reason for such an extreme attitude, and Tallinn remembers that he is the current leader of the house. He says that he has the duty to protect the family until the young one grows up and can assume his rightful place. With a serious countenance, the young man starts to remove his glasses, indicating that he took a drastic decision. Tallinn reveals a merciless look and guarantees that he will use any means necessary to protect everyone there. The scene changes to a luxurious room, where an extinguished fireplace adorns the main wall of that room. Suddenly, a scream of anger echoes through the room while furniture is violently thrown and broken. The sound of destruction continues intense, with several luxury objects being completely shattered on the floor. The blonde prince breathes pantingly in front of the immense window. Observing the wreckage around him, he screams revolted for being stuck in that place, while one of the maids listens to everything scared from outside. With fury in his eyes, he promises to tear his enemy apart and remembers that he has a pending task tomorrow. The blonde prince remembers the agreement to pretend that he would enter the imperial forest without actually going there. In the memory, he questions the reason for doing something so ridiculous, and the black-haired young man says he has business there. The protagonist explains that he does not want anyone knowing his whereabouts, and that the blonde's presence guarantees privacy. The blonde one asks, annoyed, what exactly he is plotting and what he intends to do alone in that location. The young man says in an enigmatic way that is for his treatment and suggests that the brother just wait in the room. Upon losing control, the blonde one advances furious and presses the protagonist against the wall with extreme violence. He raves, saying that the brother thinks he is important and that he could just ask for help from the imperial mages. Holding the young man's neck, he warns that patience has run out and threatens to end his life right there. Even being strangled, the young man smiles with blood in his mouth and says ironically that he should hurry. He reveals that the use of that power caused the blonde's life expectancy to decrease in a drastic way. The blonde prince suddenly starts to cough a large amount of blood, feeling an unbearable pain. The protagonist stands up free and warns that if he interrupts the treatment, he will be paralyzed for a week. He asks if the blonde one does not have curiosity to know what the reaction of everyone will be upon discovering his fall. The blonde one continues on his knees over his own blood, while the other questions if royalty would try to save him. The young man warns that if the treatment fails, another heir will assume the throne, which leaves the blonde one even more furious. With a scary look, the protagonist tells him to use his head if he really wants to continue alive in that place. He holds the blonde's chin with firmness and warns coldly that his patience also has a short limit. The young man starts to walk to the exit and warns that it is good they stop watching him, because disappearing without clues is his specialty. Upon opening the doors, he suggests that the blonde one give up those useless attempts that only delay his cure. Completely impotent on the floor, the defeated blonde prince asks, desperate, what is the young man's true objective? The protagonist stops with his back for a brief moment and repeats the question in a thoughtful way before answering. While a falcon flies through the forest skies, his voice reveals in a simple way that his objective is just to survive. The bird flies freely toward the shining horizon, crossing the green immensity of the forest under the sunlight. Some dark feathers fall slowly from the sky, indicating that the young man undid his previous transformation. He steps firmly on the grass and celebrates for having searched the entire forest without finding anyone nearby. The young man explains that he emptied the location to perform experiments with his special transformation ability. He wonders if he can transform into other animals and thinks that this ability can be very powerful. To discover this, he needs to understand exactly the limits of his power and how it can be activated. The young man messes with his bag, thinking that the main activation condition must be revealed as soon as possible. He theorizes that physical touch with the animals he used previously is the initial necessary condition. To test his hypothesis, the young man starts to prepare a small wooden trap in the middle of the forest. The young man resolves to capture a small animal to test his power and prove if his theory is correct. He places high-quality fruits as bait and soon attracts the attention of a small, curious squirrel on the trunk. The protagonist hears a noise of leaves moving and turns around quickly to see what is happening. He spots the small squirrel climbing quickly by the trunk of the large tree where he left his trap. The young man realizes that the trap was not even ready and wonders if he will manage to catch the little fellow. Even so, the small squirrel descends calmly by the trunk of the tree and stares at the young man with a curious look. Surprised by the docile approach, the young man extends his hand full of seeds, and the squirrel touches it with its paw. He plays with the little fellow, alerting him about the danger of being so friendly with unknown people in the forest. Satisfied for having managed to make the physical contact, the young man prepares to try the new transformation. The young man focuses totally to activate his ability and focuses on trying to transform himself into the small animal. A strong yellow aura shines around him the moment he tries to start the metamorphosis process. The glow goes out quickly, and the young man realizes, confused, that nothing happened to his body after the attempt. He reflects if his real intention and the desperate desire to flee or run influence the transformation. The protagonist tries to simulate the mentality of a squirrel, focusing on wanting to climb trees from there. Suddenly, the small squirrel grabs the strap of the young man's bag with its teeth and runs off with it. The young man is completely shocked to see the small animal fleeing and taking all his belongings away. He starts to pursue the little beast desperately, asking for it to return the bag full of supplies. With a quick movement, the young man finally manages to reach the tip of the bad's strap and holds it firmly. The squirrel continues pulling with incredible force upward, while it tries to climb on the huge tree trunk. Determined, the protagonist starts a bizarre tug of war against the small rodent to recover the bag. To the young man's despair, the leather bad's strap starts to rip violently due to the great force. The sound of a big fall echoes through the middle of the forest, scaring the birds that flew in the surroundings of the woods. Night falls over the immense imperial palace, bringing a mysterious calm to the great quarters. A maid knocks on the prince's door, warning timidly that she prepared dinner, and he tells her to come in. She opens the door, praying in silence for the prince to be calm and not vent his anger on her today. The young woman enters panic upon seeing his clothes totally filthy, and the prince tries to reassure the maid. The young man thinks relieved that he was almost caught by the maid. At the moment he returned in the form of a crow. He laments in silence for not having discovered how to transform and for having spent the day running from the squirrel. The maid observes her lord in an apprehensive way, noting that something very unusual seems to be happening. The prince orders that she bring new clean clothes, and the maid agrees, but hesitates with a worried look. The black-haired young man gets confused with the girl's reaction and asks what is making her so nervous. The girl points trembling to the leather bag and asks if he really brought the squirrel with him. He is completely shocked to look down and realize that the audacious beast entered his pouch. The squirrel jumps from the bag and starts to run through the luxurious room while the young man tries to capture it. Annoyed, desperate, the maid begs to spare the little beast's life, offering herself to put it out of the palace. Ignoring the appeal, the young man just repeats in a firm way his previous order for her to bring his garments. He raves with a scary look, demanding that she bring his new clothes immediately from there. Terrified by the prince's shout, the young servant runs off in a dash through the long corridors of the location. She thinks, desperate, that she needs to return quickly to save the small squirrel before it is too late. The girl runs holding the clean garments, but suddenly is interrupted by an imposing figure on the path. She raises her eyes, scared, and realizes that she just bumped directly into the feared first princess. The blonde noble recognizes Rand's maid and asks with superiority the reason for so much hurry in the corridors. The maid throws herself on the floor, begging for her life, and the princess asks what garments are those in her hands. The princess accuses the girl of stealing imperial property, and the maid denies, desperate, swearing by the great hero. The maid justifies that the seventh prince's garments dirty in the garden, and the noble extends her hand over her. She says coldly that it does not matter if the story is true or false, because lying to her is impossible. The princess uses magic to verify if the servant is telling the truth or just inventing a silly excuse. Suddenly, the noble's eyes glow intensely, and she realizes that there is something very strange with that situation. Through her magic vision, she discovers that the prince was not in the garden as the girl had claimed before. The first princess realizes that her younger brother was secretly doing business in the imperial forest. Back to the palace room, the protagonist talks mentally with himself, thinking of his next steps. He tells the squirrel that the castle is not a good place to live and that he has no intention of adopting it in any way. The young man extends his arms, offering help to take it back to the forest, and asks for the beast to cooperate calmly. The squirrel stands in a defensive position and starts to squeak loudly, refusing the direct commands of its captor. He thinks, annoyed, that it makes no sense to have a wild squirrel running freely through the royal palace. The noise makes him remember his past life on Earth, where rats scratched the walls of his small room. Feeling stressed by the direction the story is taking, he launches himself quickly to grab the rodent once and for all. The young man celebrates upon capturing the cute squirrel and orders it to enter in a tame way into his travel bag. The wild little beast bites the protagonist's hand with force, making him let out a sharp cry of pain through the room. The prince is furious and shouts at the beast, questioning how it dares to bite the hand of a member of royalty. The squirrel jumps with a lot of agility far away and starts to climb swiftly by the main column of the room. The protagonist looks up, shocked, to see that the animal managed to reach the highest and inaccessible point of the ceiling. He realizes that trying to climb up there will be useless because the animal will easily flee to another direction. The black-haired young man closes his eyes and thinks that it would be easier if he transformed himself into a squirrel. Suddenly, he opens wide one of his eyes upon feeling a strong and familiar magical sensation going through his entire body. The young man realizes the immense golden energy emanating from his own chest and wonders if he finally succeeded. A strong magic light involves the young man the moment he starts to go through the complete transformation into a squirrel. Through his own experience, he realizes that he finally managed to unravel the secret of that ability. Now in the form of the small rodent, the protagonist gives an intelligent and victorious smile for having had success in the test. The other small, wild squirrel ends up losing balance way up there and starts to plummet toward the floor. Thinking quickly, the young man throws himself with everything in the air in his animal form and manages to cushion the small beast's fall. Suddenly, the room door opens, revealing the princess, who enters by surprise, ignoring the warnings of the maid. She observes her brother's quarters with disdain and complains quietly about how the servants of the location are unpleasant there. The noble stops in the middle of the great marble corridor. Upon spotting a strange and small silhouette right in front of her, she is perplexed to see a small squirrel holding the other squirrel in its lap in an extremely friendly way. The noble is horrified upon realizing wild animals running free through the brothers' castle corridors. The brown-haired maid is extremely enchanted with the cute scene and holds back the crying from so much emotion. The protagonist in his squirrel form gets upset and thinks that situation is becoming a big madness. The next day, the sun shines brightly on the horizon, illuminating the great white towers of the imperial palace. Back to the room, the young man caresses the small rodent on the table and amuses himself upon seeing how it is well fed. The young man notes that the beast does not stay away from him since the fall and wonders if it is grateful for the heroic rescue. He warns the squirrel to stay hidden in the room, to not create new problems with the palace security. The young man celebrates for having discovered the bizarre and ridiculous necessary condition to activate his transformations. The young man starts to analyze in his thoughts all the creatures in which he already managed to transform until today. He realizes that the crow and the black horse possessed exactly the same essential characteristic before changing. The young man concludes that to transform, he needs to touch in a very precise way the nape of each one of those animals. With the mystery resolved, he returns to focus on the danger that the first princess represents for his plans. He recalls that the noble possessed a terrifying expression, very different from the light descriptions of his book. He thinks that he was saved thanks to the excuse of Anna having said that the heroic squirrel was just the pet. The prince managed to return to his human form in the courtyard and return to the room, thinking that everything would end in peace. The princess says she finds his choice of mascot exotic and warns that she is leaving because of the late hour. Before crossing the door, the princess orders in a very direct way that the young man must go find her tomorrow morning. The first princess exhibits an enigmatic smile upon, saying that they possess serious subjects to discuss tomorrow. The young man stays thoughtful in his room, wondering what she wants so much to talk to him about in such a sudden way. He questions himself, worried if the noble would have in some way discovered his true identity of reincarnated. Without many options, the young man accepts that he cannot refuse the invitation and plays with the squirrel that continues eating at the location. The seventh prince arrives at the marked location, and a knight in armor makes a respectful bow to receive him. The young man is impressed with the colossal size of the golden doors of the first princess's private room. Upon entering the luxurious hall, the young man finds the first princess elegantly sitting on her luxurious sofa. She offers a seat in a gentle way, but the young man refuses politely. Wanting to go straight to the subject of that meeting, her countenance changes quickly to a cold posture upon questioning if he really did not hear her order to sit down. Intimidated by the sister's strong presence, the young man immediately apologizes for his lack of courtesy there in the hall. The noble smiles and says it is okay because she understands that his great curiosity always made him someone very impatient. She analyzes the brother, suspicious, wondering how he changed so much to the point of venturing alone through that forest. The young man thinks tense about the danger of being there, knowing that facing that perceptive woman was what he feared the most. The narration explains that the man's power always manifests itself in natural elements like the emperor's fire and the brother's water. However, the special manus of the first princess is something very different and dangerous that positions itself above all others. Her element is called human and grants her the terrible capacity of reading and also of manipulating people's minds. With a dark look, the princess says she hopes he is sincere because she gets very sad when her family tries to lie. Upon feeling her hand on his head, the young man tries to keep calm, knowing that the mental reading power does not work on him. He deduces that if the power were working, she would already have controlled his mind to extract all his answers. He remembers that according to the romance, her power fails if the target has blood ties and also family love. The real problem resides in this second rule, because it is necessary to have genuine family love so that the barrier works. As the young man would never feel love for her, the young man does not understand how her power failed, and she demands that he answer quickly. He questions himself with a lot of apprehension what would be the true reason why the mental control magic did not affect him there. Meanwhile, in another location, very far away, the scene shows a dark cave hidden right behind an immense waterfall. In the humid interior of that grotto, the drops of water fall slowly from the sharp tips of several stone stalactites. A single shining drop starts to form on the tip of the rock, about to fall into the complete darkness of that humid location. The drop falls directly onto the eyes of an elderly man who finds himself lying and motionless on the floor of beaten earth. The old duke opens his eyes, revealing a face extremely tired and marked by terrible combat scars. He tries to recover his breath with immense difficulty, letting out weak groans of pain while he tries to move his arms. The man holds his head, feeling a strong migraine, and wonders, confused, where exactly he is located now. A mysterious figure dressed in a black hood says calmly that he survived, and the elderly warrior gets startled by the voice. The elder wants to know his identity, and the hooded young man reveals that he thought the warrior was already dead in the grotto. With an intimidating movement, the mysterious rescuer holds the handle of his sword and warns that he will start asking questions. He points the shining blade to the duke's neck, demanding to know if the elderly warrior is still loyal to the great empire. The young hooded one says coldly that the warrior's next answer will define the destiny of his life right there in the cave.